meeting. Thank you very much for joining us this event about the similarities, challenges Ukraine and Croatia may have as post-war country. Of course, it is more a hope for Ukraine being a post-war country like Croatia is, with maybe with the same challenges and hopes for EU integration, transatlantic integration. This event is part of our series of events we organized at the Institute for Danube region and Central Europe. And it's now a joint event together with the Center for Advanced Studies of the University of Rijeka. I'm really great to have Tena as partner for this event. Also, I'm really happy to organize this event together with the University of Rijeka, with the Center for Advanced Studies of Southeastern Europe. Also because I was quite often in Rijeka, so I have this kind of history also with Rijeka and Fiume. My institute, where I'm working in Vienna, it is the Institute for Danube region and Central Europe. It is the oldest think tank in Austria, dealing with the whole region from Vilnius to Tirana. And this year we were celebrating our 70 years anniversary. Last week we had a big celebration party at the Palais of Lower Austria in Vienna, but we still organizing other events in the framework of our anniversary. So we had different workshops, panel discussions in Vilnius, in Ljubljana, in Prague, in Budapest, in Vienna, and now in online in Rijeka. Next week I will travel to Kosovo, to Pristina, to attend a workshop about the interethnic dialogues between the Serbian minority and the Albanian majority in Kosovo. So that is the whole framework why we are organizing this panel discussion, or this discussion, together with the Center for Advanced Studies in Rijeka. And as I said, our institution, the Institute for Danube region and Central Europe, is a well-based think tank, independent think tank in Austria. So if you are in Vienna, then you can contact me. Maybe for the people in Rijeka, Fiume, the name of Erhard Buzek can be familiar. He was honorary professor at the University of Rijeka, and he was the chairman of our institute. The topic of the discussion we are organizing is the challenges and hopes for two countries with war and post-war experiences. So the point is not that Croatia should stand as a model of success that Ukraine must follow one-to-one, like a good student. However, Croatia is a country that experienced a civil war in the 90s and then underwent a successful European integration. So in this way, it can be maybe an interesting example also for Ukraine. While current news about Ukraine is dominated by the war, it is essential to think about how Ukraine can shape its own future after the conflict and how it can address the political, economical, and social aspects of dealing with the war experiences and traumas. And that's why we try to ask what similarities and common challenges existed in Croatia and Ukraine before the war, such as the transition to a different type of economy, national independence, minority issues, or different approaches to national history with debates on memory politics. It means how can a post-war situation be addressed from legal, political, and social perspectives? How can issues like minority rights, memory, debates on memory politics shape the future of Croatia and Ukraine, even for a possible EU integration for Ukraine. That's why we try to compare the two countries with their own experiences, challenges, and maybe, as I said, it can be an interesting example for Ukraine, but also for Croatia, because the post-war situation is maybe a never-ending story, even for Croatia, with ongoing debates on memory politics or other social issues. So that's why I'm really happy to have really important researcher from all of Europe, so from Netherlands, Croatia, Italy, the UK, to discuss with us these questions. We will have short comments on some aspects I addressed for 10-12 minutes from each participants, and after we will open the discussion to the participants, because it should be really a discussion with all the participants of this event. And really thank you for joining us, and I hope we will have an interesting 1.5 hour debating about Ukraine and Croatia and their experiences regarding pre-war and post-war situations.
Thank you very much, Peter, for introducing the discussion and for starting this topic in the first place. Let me extend your warm welcome on behalf of the Center of Advanced Studies on Southeastern Europe of the University of Rijeka. My name is Tena Prelec, and I'm an assistant professor here. First off, let me give you some very quick housekeeping rules for the discussion and for the questions and answers afterwards. We will now have our very welcome and renowned speakers here with us to give their insights. Each of them will have about 10 minutes at their disposal. Afterwards, we will open the floor for questions and answers. You have two options. If you wish, you can write your question in the chat, and Peter, who will lead the Q&A afterwards, will read your question to the speakers. Otherwise, you can raise your hand and we will give you the word to ask the question yourself. In the meantime, please keep yourself on mute while other people are talking. So without further ado, let me introduce the first of our speakers. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Iva Vukušić, who's an assistant professor in international history at Utrecht University and also a visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London in the UK. Aside from being really very rapidly rising star, I would say, in the field of war crimes in academia, Eva has also a rich background as a practitioner, having worked at the SCTY in The Hague and also the Special Department for War Crimes at the Office of the Prosecutor in Sarajevo before signing up for her PhD program. So there's really no better person to tell us about the issue of war crimes in comparing the experiences of Croatia and Ukraine, and perhaps not only Croatia, but the wider Southeastern Europe as well. So Eva, questions that you might want to address are comparing these two experiences and really trying to understand what these challenges that Ukraine is facing and how we can compare them to what the countries of the Western Balkans went through, what we can expect from these trials, and also what do you think, which kind of expectations should be realistic and what should be unrealistic on part of Ukraine going forward? Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tena, and thank you for your kind invitation to participate. I'm very happy to be here with you today. So my plan is basically to briefly outline some key accomplishments, opportunities, and challenges to war crimes prosecutions. And this will be sort of a short list of observations that are hopefully useful when thinking about justice and accountability in Ukraine. So I'm a historian, but as you already said, I'm also a practitioner, having worked in different institutions and having observed war crimes trials for now the best part of 20 years. So I will be using an acronym ICTY, which many in the audience will know is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia here in The Hague. It was established in 1993, closed in 2017. It has indicted 161 people and I think convicted 89. So just to have a bit of a sense, this may be an acronym that you will hear me mention. So I want to just start with a couple of notes about how Ukraine and the former Yugoslavia are similar and different from sort of the aspect of war crimes trials. And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list. But the first thing that I think is a major difference, of course, is the former Yugoslavia had a special UN court, which Ukraine at the moment does not have. So this is a major difference, and it influences significantly the capacity, the institutional capacity to deal with what seems to be thousands and thousands and thousands of credible allegations of war crimes and other crimes being perpetrated on the territory of Ukraine. There might be a special tribunal for aggression coming for Ukraine, but that's a separate discussion, and we could get into it if people are interested. Of course, the states in the former Yugoslavia were not nuclear-armed permanent members of the UN Security Council, which means that the extent to which they were able to be influenced by the international community, as we often call it, were probably different. Russia is, of course, on the Security Council. It's a nuclear-armed state, so it's a different actor, so to say, to be dealing with. The former Yugoslavia, when the ICTY was established, was not asked, people in Croatia or Bosnia and Herzegovina or Serbia or Kosovo or other places were not asked what kind of court they wanted, which is a little bit different now. The Ukrainians are very vocal and passionate about advocating for what they want in terms of institutional responses. And even when I disagree with particular points that Ukrainian representatives are making, I have a lot of respect for the fact that they're making space for themselves in ways that the former Yugoslavia really never managed, I think, to. One, I think, similarities between Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Ukraine, for example, are the massive workload. So the similarity is really in that all of these countries faced a future where they should investigate 5, 10, 20,000 people potentially for crime. So the workload is immense. And this is something that I think the former Yugoslavia has experienced in the aftermath of the war, and Ukraine is experiencing, even though, of course, the war is still ongoing. There are some capacity challenges that I think are quite similar as well. You know, the former Yugoslavia, as well as Ukraine, has not started off with hundreds and hundreds of trained lawyers with the expertise or investigators with this expertise. But of course, like the former Yugoslavia, Ukraine as well has through the years, especially since 2014, developed a lot of that capacity. So there are certain similarities, but also, of course, some key differences. Let me now move on to accomplishments of war crimes trials more broadly. If we look at the former Yugoslavia, what can Ukraine possibly hope for? One, I would say, conclusion after almost 25 years of war crimes prosecution in the former Yugoslavia through the court here in The Hague, but also, of course, in the region, is that the results are fairly humble. The war crimes prosecution effort, war crimes trials more broadly, I would say provide some justice to some victims some of the time. Most perpetrators, unfortunately, walk free. And this is the reality in most conflicts around the world. So I would suggest that the Ukrainians consider fairly humble goals, because I think maximalist goals are simply too difficult to achieve and will lead to disappointment. We also know from the former Yugoslavia that war crimes prosecution and trials in themselves don't bring reconciliation, and this is also something that we can discuss later. In relation to mechanisms that were potentially beneficial in the former Yugoslavia, the EU conditionality as it was applied, for example, in Croatia for cooperation with the tribunal in The Hague, were, I would say, largely successful. So maybe this is also relevant that as part of the EU path, certain reforms can be sort of expected. So there might be ways in which those kinds of mechanisms can advance a purpose of fair and proper war crimes proceedings. Ultimately, what a lot of war crimes prosecution does is, and this is, I think, really important, what Diane Ordentlicher, who is an American legal scholar, called shrinking the space for denial, which means that, for example, if we take Srebrenica, very few people, I would say, in the mainstream, even in really nationalist circles in Serbia, for example, would say nothing happened in Srebrenica. This is this shrinking the space of denial, in the sense that there are today arguments about the number of victims, the circumstances in which they were killed in Srebrenica, or things like that. But the very fact that thousands of people were killed, I think, is broadly accepted. For example, the nationalists might call it a terrible crime, a strašan zločin, and not a genocide, but the space of denial, I think, shrank. And that's an important contribution. I think war crimes trials, generally speaking, work best when their purpose is fairly narrowly defined, and they need to work in complementary to other mechanisms, such as reparations, psychosocial support for survivors, finding missing persons, broader legal reforms. So war crimes trials sort of can't be our only approach to find justice and accountability. And just a couple of more notes, I guess, on opportunities and on challenges of war crimes prosecution more broadly. I think an opportunity and important contribution is establishing facts. Investigations and trials really uncover the detail of much of what had happened. They put some perpetrators into jail and sort of off the streets. And they can also be an important way of having an acknowledgement of harm. Survivors often want a broader social sort of recognition that they went through something terrible. And a process like that can be that public recognition of harm. As a historian, of course, I want to emphasize the importance of archives in this process. So war crimes trials collect, produce a lot of documentary evidence that we as researchers can use. I wrote a book about paramilitaries based on ICTY evidence. Other colleagues of mine, for example, Christian Nielsen, used this archive, Hikmet Karčić. So there's really a lot that we can use beyond the outcome itself that can, I think, be beneficial, which is to know what happened. Also, one thing that I think is an opportunity is to build up capacity in the legal system more broadly in Ukraine. And of course, by now, this has been happening for years, but strengthening of knowledge base, experience, connections, and relations to other professionals that kind of help the Ukrainian legal system with this enormous task of investigating war crimes can be really beneficial for the legal system. And just a couple of more notes on challenges, and then I will end. Of course, war crimes prosecution as an effort depends on political will and resources and commitment. So they are also vulnerable because they depend on political forces, both inside the country and outside. That is, I think, a weak point, so to say. And we have seen evidence of this in Croatia as well. And I'm sure there's challenges in Ukraine in the same way. A challenge is also that states will have to have a proper sort of legal framework that is conducive to investigations and prosecutions, and to have robust fair trials protections. So I think this is also a challenge often for states that are in wartime or have recently came into a post-war period. What I think is really important to realize is that war crimes prosecution is a long-term commitment. 20, 30 years is needed. So at least, and we have seen this in the former Yugoslavia as well. You can look at it as a glass half empty of glass half full. But in the former Yugoslavia, I would say there's about 1,000 people that were prosecuted in person in the last 30 years in The Hague and in the region. On the one hand, it's not that much. On the other hand, is much more than in many other contexts. So trials are long, expensive, and it's also difficult sometimes for the public to follow these proceedings. So you also need to have journalists that will make sure that the public understand what is going on. There's other challenges, like, of course, these political pressures. In Croatia, we had seen a lot of trouble with prosecuting Croatian forces. Our boys, naši dečki, it's very difficult to prosecute your own. And I think some similar challenges will definitely be happening in Ukraine as well. For Russians, of course, it's going to be difficult to get your hands on a lot of the suspects. I mean, we, of course, have an International Criminal Court warrant out for Putin. He's not very likely to be easily accessible for trials. So there's many challenges. And I think one way to go about them is to do in absentia trials. So these are trials that are held basically without the suspect being physically there. This is something that Croatia has done and Ukraine has been doing. I remain unconvinced that trials without the suspect actually there present are the right way to go about this. But we can also, of course, discuss this in the Q&A. And just to close off this sort of list of things that I think would be good for us to think about going forward, war crimes prosecution is expensive, it's politically fraught, it's imperfect, it's frustrating, it doesn't bring reconciliation, it's often disappointing, and it's difficult. And yet I would argue it must be done. And this is also, I think, something that the Ukrainians have very much shown that is important to them. So I think a lot of support will be needed and has been, I think, also coming to Ukraine to support in this effort because, and I'll end on this, the need is such, they're dealing with thousands upon thousands of cases. They're in wartime. The capacity for this is lacking because no other state would also be able to prosecute 10 or 20,000 cases, the Netherlands or Sweden or whatever other country you may think of. So the burden is immense. But again, as I was saying, it must be done. And I'll end here. So thank you so much for your attention. And I welcome your questions later. I hope I was on time.
Eva, thank you so much for raising a number of really great and very important points. I find this point that you raised about managing expectations and especially considering how dashed hopes is a huge factor in the region, also for the lack then of change and of transformation. That's really important. But I also loved this concept of shrinking the space for denial that you mentioned. So basically finding also other ways to get to justice, to cope with the fact that justice might be limited from what we expect from a formal trial. So thank you so much. Now let's get on to another topic, which is the political economy of the war. I find this angle extremely important, and I try to address it to some extent in my research as well, also because of the experience really of the Southeastern European states. I feel that in the wars in former Yugoslavia, we spent so much time after the end of the wars in the 1990s, talking about ethnic conflicts, some issues of religions and of ethnicities who hate each other, that we kind of missed the boat to talk about the economic changes that were happening right in front of our eyes while the conflict was raging. So what happened, it was clear to everybody afterwards, which is that basically there was a lot of corruption, that elites ended up getting rich during this time while young people were dying on the front. And it also has long-term implications, of course, because it enhances bitterness among the population. And in the long run, you have lower trust in institutions and in politics. So that's why I think it's so important that there are people working on the political economy aspect of this war as we speak. And one of them is Professor David Lewis from the University of Exeter. Welcome, David. David is an expert in Russian foreign policy, and it was really a great pleasure to work with him and continue working with him on the issue of illicit finance and Russian foreign policy, how the two are connected. David has also taken this work further in applying it specifically on Ukraine and looking at the occupied territory. So he started to develop really a political economy of the occupation, understanding how the elites are changing, what is the influence of Russia in it, and what are the lessons that we might take from it. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jenna. Thanks so much for the invitation. I think it's a really great sort of conceptual format to think about the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think we've got a lot of lessons to learn from the Balkans, so I'm really interested to hear what others have to say on this topic as well. I do have a few slides, so I will share those, but I just really want to flag that point that I'm just, I think I need permission to show you my slides from our host. I really want to make the point that Chen has already made, that the war is obviously focused primarily at the moment on the sort of military analysis of what's happening on the front line. And I think the time is now shifting somewhat to look at a slightly broader context. And that includes economic aspects, which for a long time, to be honest, were rather underestimated. So I've been particularly, as Jenna said, looking at the economics of the occupied territories. But I think some of this, to be honest, also has implications perhaps for both Russia and Ukraine. We can see a kind of war economy emerging on both sides, which involves redistribution of property, new elites emerging, new sort of oligarchs emerging in parts of the Russian political economy. And I think that's an interesting and really under-researched area. Just briefly wanted to go through a few points on what's happening in the occupied territories, a reminder of what we're talking about here. And here's a map that shows, for those of you who read Russian, that Russia's interest in the occupation is not only strategic or ideological, but also has an economic aspect. Here is pointing out the various resources available in a very sort of 19th century imperialist kind of way, the kind of resources that are available for Russia to seize and plunder in the newly occupied territories and in the DNR, LNR, and of course Crimea as well. So what's been happening here? We've seen actually over a number of conflicts that Russia's developed economics as a kind of weapon of control. We saw it in Chechnya, where you had this patron-client network at the center of Russian control networks run through the Chechen leadership. We saw a similar process in Syria. We've seen Central African Republic as a kind of archetype of this kind of Russian understanding of how business and illicit finance underpins really a Russian military and security presence. And so we're seeing the same thing occurring in the occupied territories in Ukraine. Initially, this was very crude. Spring 2022, you saw all those pictures in social media of Russian forces simply running away with goodies from the Ukrainian economy, including from people's houses, but also rather large-scale looting, for example, of steel and coal from major metals plants in the east, or, as you see there, agricultural equipment. So this is a very sort of crude beginning to the process. Over a time, this became much more organized as Russia put in place these political military civilian administrations and gradually went through this process of asserting political control. But alongside that political control, you also had a process of economic control that went alongside it. And with that increasing administrative presence that occurs after 30th September 2022, when Russia claims to have annexed these 4 regions, you then see this huge sort of bureaucratic process that is sort of happening a little bit under the radar, but is really an everyday change to the laws, the regulations, the business arrangements of people living in southeastern Ukraine, and a full transition to Russian laws and regulations by 1st of January 2026 is envisaged. So we're starting to see, excuse me, some of the obvious sort of legal and institutional obstacles that are going to come up if and when these territories are reintegrated into Ukraine. The longer this goes on, the more Russia consolidates its power, the more Russia becomes able to, as it were, normalize the occupation and consolidate its sort of legal and administrative presence in the region. And then at the same time, we've also seen this process really of mass seizure of Ukrainian businesses through a process that is really nationalization, but is really sort of given a sort of facade of taking over so-called abandoned properties, which really means anybody who refuses to work with the Russians. And these properties are being redistributed to loyal pro-Moscow cronies, people coming in from Crimea, southern Russia in particular, to try and take over this property. In other words, there's a huge redistribution of property, which of course creates all sorts of moral and humanitarian problems, but also in the future creates a huge range of legal problems, even if Ukraine is able to liberate these territories militarily. You're then going to face a huge range of problems in trying to ensure business restitution to the rightful owners. In the meantime, there's a whole range of problems for people actually working and living in the region in terms of their legal status. We'll come on to that in a minute, given Ukraine's quite strict collaboration laws. At the same time, of course, some of this has international impact. We've seen a big rise in illicit grain exports from Zaporizhia and Kherson through a whole network of grey and off-the-books channels, including ships that are not properly registered, and a whole range of offshore companies as well. So in other words, while the war is being fought on the front line and people are dying on both sides, there are a lot of Russian companies and people connected to the Russian government who are making a good deal of money out of the present situation. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind as the conflict goes forward, the increasing range of people with a vested interest in the conflict continuing, and also Russia's presence continuing in southern Ukraine as well. At the same time as you've got this money coming out, as it were, of Ukraine, you've also got a lot of money going in. Big multi-billion-dollar Russian reconstruction program. But obviously, this being the Russian political economy, there's a very opaque process in which tenders are favoring insider companies. So again, a whole process in which enrichment is going on, really on the back, obviously, of the destruction of these cities by the Russian military in the first place. Most famously, of course, in Mariupol, where much of this reconstruction is centered. And many of these key construction companies obviously linked to the Kremlin, but also more specifically to the Ministry of Defense, which has a big sort of corporate structure around it now, very big defense budget, of course. And again, lots of people finding ways to enrich themselves through this process. So again, this raises difficult questions for reintegration. What happens to this reconstruction when and if Ukraine regains control? I think is quite difficult to assess. You can see the kind of thing that the Russians are trying to construct here, really a sort of attempt to build up a kind of ersatz new Russia in these territories, calling it New Mariupol and so on and so forth. Very similar, of course, to the campaign in Grozny and Chechnya. We just heard about the problem of war crimes, and this reconstruction campaign is one way in which Russia is trying to really erase evidence of Russian war crimes and trying to also at the same time obliterate the Ukrainian history of Mariupol as a Ukrainian city. So there's huge political implications for what Russia's doing, but there is a sort of economic bedrock to its campaign in the occupied territories that I think we really have to focus on as well. What's all this doing? Well, it's trying to normalize occupation, really, and reduce resistance. Russia understands that you can't simply maintain occupation through the use of violence and repression. That is an important part, obviously, of their strategy, but they're also trying to use economic levers to co-opt local business, for example, to build up a local elite that will support them, and also to use a kind of policy of relatively generous welfare and salary payments to try and win people over to their side, or at least to try and reduce overt opposition in these areas. And to a certain extent, I think this is probably happening certainly perhaps in Mariupol and in other areas under Russian rule as well. What's going to happen if and when Ukraine is able to regain these territories is going to be very complex. You're going to have a lot of legal and transitional processes just to manage sort of the everyday events that still continue to occur, right, during occupation. There is, of course, international law around occupation, and that law is, of course, broadly ignored by Russia, which doesn't see itself as an occupying power, but nevertheless, there are obvious war crimes that are emerging from this. But simply in terms of the everyday business and sort of life transactions that I think are going to be part of the reintegration process, I'm not sure Ukraine is completely ready for reintegrating a society that's been under Russian occupation for a long time. This is particularly true, of course, of those territories that have been under Russian occupation since 2014, and where there's been a long period of socialization into the Russian sort of media sphere and Russian information sphere. But it's also going to be increasingly difficult, even in those areas of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, the Russian controls now. Just finally, I think it's worth mentioning the question of collaboration, on which others may have some interest and experience. This is a very sensitive and controversial topic in Ukraine, of course, but it does make it difficult in all sorts of ways for people living under the occupation to be engaged in business and to have some kind of economic activity. That leaves open some problems in the way that these laws are going to be prosecuted, and of course may be part of a quite difficult reintegration process when we get to that in the future. At the moment, talked about the number of war crimes cases being open and the huge burden that is impacting on the Ukrainian prosecutor's office. The same for these cases of alleged collaboration, thousands of these building up. And the problem is that some of this is rather selective, it appears. And of course, some Ukrainian human rights groups have argued that it may criminalize sometimes perfectly legitimate activities. And as you see there, one prosecutor at least suggests that many existing residents of Crimea would fall foul of these laws. So there's a big policy implication here about maintaining a kind of political campaign on behalf of Ukraine to try and win back these territories. It's not just going to be a military campaign. If they do want to win back control, they're going to have to address these very difficult political problems going forward. But as I say, this is a very sensitive area and one in which obviously people in Ukraine have very different views on the right way forward. I will wrap up there, but if you are interested in this topic, the project that Tiana and I are both involved in, we have put out a recent report on this, on economic crime, illicit finance in Russia's occupation regime in Ukraine, with lots more detail in it. But I would really welcome any reflections and comparative aspects that might come to people's minds from the Balkans or elsewhere in Southeastern Europe as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Indeed, it will be very interesting to hear if somebody has thoughts in terms of the comparisons here, and also will be interesting to hear the reaction from Ukraine. We will have our CAS fellow Alexander Moskalenko joining us later from ground. But before getting to Alex, we have another really welcome guest here with us, Dr. Senada Šelo-Šabić from Zagreb, tackling the topic of EU enlargement. Obviously, EU enlargement is a huge topic for Ukraine, having received the status of candidate country at a record in a record time frame last year. But we know in Southeastern Europe that this is only the beginning of the road, right? So for Croatia, it took a very long time to get there, to get to the finishing line of becoming eventually EU member state, whereas other countries of the Western Balkans are still in the waiting room. So Senada, who's a senior scientific associate in the Department for International Economic and Political Relations at IRMO, which is Croatia's premier think tank on international relations. Among her rich opus, she's also worked a lot on EU enlargement, both on the Croatian experience and on the one of the other Western Balkan states. Senada, the floor is yours. Please give us your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you, Tena, and warm greetings to my co-fellow panelists, but also to the audience that is following us today. We are bringing like enlarging the complexity of the picture in relation to the topic, what or how do we compare or contrast Ukraine's experience and then the Western Balkan experience. In the context of enlargement, yes, Croatia did have a lengthy path in comparison to previous enlargements, which only tells you that future paths, at least learning from the experience that we have had, is going to be even longer. Croatia marks the 10th anniversary of its EU membership this year, but all 7 at the time Western Balkan countries were promised EU perspective in 2003. 20 years on, Croatia, as I said, is the only EU member state, and 6 other countries are in the pipeline. If the EU granting candidacy status to Ukraine and Moldova is really, and you are right, Tena, it has been a game changer in the context of the enlargement discussion, which has been prolonged and quite depressing, and this was described as there is no appetite and or no capacity of the EU to enlarge, and this has changed. We now have a date. Well, not necessarily a fixed date, but somehow post line 2030 as a year in which the EU would prepare itself to be ready to enlarge. And this is the big question: what does it mean? The EU internal reform by many is viewed as a precondition for enlargement. And taking into account the complexity of the discussion, sensitivity of decisions that should be taken, and opposing or varying positions of different EU member states, there is no promise that this discussion on internal EU reform is going to be expanded and certainly not finished by 2030. So this is a big conceptual issue. Do we link the internal reform to the enlargement process? But then those who claim yes say that there is no possibility that the current EU could function with additional new members, taking into account veto possibility, the makeup of the Commission, the number of MEPs, and so on and so on. Not to mention budgetary issues, QMV and other issues that are discussed. So this is a big question. Those who are proposing or pushing for enlargement are claiming that the 2 processes can take place in parallel, and that the EU could advance with supporting candidate states in reforming themselves, while at the same time discussing new institutional arrangements and political agreements. In that sense, there is a new concept or new solution that is proposed, and that is gradual accession. So new candidate country or candidate states could gradually accede into the EU. This is a new concept and hasn't been tested, so we'll see how that will go. In terms of geopolitical considerations, because everybody is speaking now about the enlargement being driven by geopolitical considerations, the accession of 6 Western Balkan countries, just looking geographically, is actually not enlargement, it's consolidation of the EU territory, because these 6 countries are surrounded by EU member states. Financially also, it's less demanding because all 6 countries have less than 18 million people, taking into account a huge emigration from this region. And they have been waiting for a very long time, therefore some sort of dynamic has been already established. The Eastern enlargement, which would be the expansion of the EU towards the east, to Ukraine, Moldova, and possibly Georgia, is a different challenge for the European Union. And the enthusiasm which has been expressed last year and still this year, I'm worried is not going to be easily sustained. We are going soon to enter discussions for a new financial framework, 2028, 2035, okay, in like a year and a half time. But budgetary considerations or financial issues are always the key issues, and this is going to be a tough discussion. We also have to take into account that after the next EU elections, we may have more populist voices in the European Parliament, and populists are never or haven't been traditionally pro-enlargement. And then also given the relationship that the EU has with the United States in terms of our transatlantic cooperation, our security concerns, and so on, the results of the American elections will also impact our capacity and will and ability to decide which way to go or how to frame and how to drive the enlargement discussion and the process. I'm not the only thing that I think I can say is that if and when, it's not a question of if, I would say. I think it is extremely it's logical and is clear to many that, especially, as I said, with Western Balkan enlargement, the consolidation or filling up the gap, the empty space with these 6 countries is essential, or it's would be a realpolitik clear decision by the EU, and then framing of this stronger EU shaping its eastern or negotiations with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and thinking about the broader space that such enlargement would entail in terms of new neighbors that are going to be at the EU borders and so on, is going to be something that occupies minds of people in the years ahead. But to go back to what I just wanted to say is that whatever is the outcome of the new of enlargement or taking new countries, it's not going to be the EU plus. We are going to have a different European Union, and this discussion about the EU reform is actually redesigning the EU, and new members are actually going to be members in a different European Union that we know today. What kind of union? This is unclear, but the current shape, with the current dynamic, even without discussion on enlargement, I don't think we have much more time to continue functioning. Divisions and polarization and disagreements are really running deep.
Senada, thank you so much. I can only underline your call for the 2 processes to happen in parallel. I think that is really well put. The fact that in the internal reform of the European Union and the various reforms that need to happen for enlargement, and enlargement itself can and should happen in parallel. I think it's definitely a really well formulated thought, because we've seen that a lot of kicking the can down the road has been done so far, with delays in starting negotiations, with new methodologies for EU enlargement, and so on and so forth. And in the meantime, what we had in the Western Balkans was that a lot of the momentum for democracy has deflated due to widespread disappointment, right? So this is one of the criticisms that is also moved towards this new model that you mentioned of a staged accession. So some say, well, but wait, do we need to add more, even more obstacles? Should we not, get to the work? Although of course, there are a lot of proponents for it as well. So I'm really curious to hear what Alex thinks about it. Our next speaker is Dr. Alexander Moskalenko. He's a researcher who focuses on European politics and law. He's also been in resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C., and he's joining us from Ukraine right now. He's currently, I'm happy to say, a non-resident fellow at our center at the University of Rijeka. So Alex, please tell us from your research findings and also from your perspective on ground in Ukraine, where do these thoughts about EU enlargement experiences find you? What are your thoughts about it? And also, I know that that you were intending to address the big question, the $1 million question. When can we expect this conflict to end? When can we actually get to, you know, to do the work, the political work, and these technical steps that we're talking about, with finally a situation in which at least the conflict can be managed to a certain extent? Alex, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me for the talk. Well, what can I say? My current work about comparative analysis of the conditionality is still a work in progress, so it raises more questions rather than answers. But there is a positive point to mention. I think it would be a good start. The example of Croatia demonstrates that everything is possible, right? So the tasks that Ukraine has mentioned for itself of joining European Union and NATO is possible to be achieved, and this is the positive outcome that we can see from the experience of Croatia. But there are a lot of other things to mention. Well, I will try to address the issue in three different perspectives, perhaps. Number one, a little bit about a theory of conditionality, and number two, about the differences between Western Balkans and Ukraine, and number three is about the similarities. So, speaking about theory, well, it was supposed to be kind of easy way to go. So the European Union sets conditions, candidate country fulfills it, and then it becomes a member of the European Union. But it didn't work that good. So there is a positive experience of Central and Eastern European countries. The first big enlargement of the beginning of 2000 years of 2000. And then we have a problem. So not a single other case was successful in terms of conditionality. So if you think of Eastern neighborhood, so it was a failure. If you think of the Western Balkans, it still is a failure. If you think about the countries of Southern neighborhood, it's also a failure. And there is it raises kind of a legitimate question if conditionality is a good policy at all. And it's still to be answered, because conditionality is really different from the initial approach that the European Union had. So your initial approach was so-called community method, right? But community method implied that all the countries are equal, and there is a need to develop some kind of consensus which would satisfy all the countries. In terms of conditionality, we have a clear division and asymmetry. So there is somebody who sets the condition, and there is somebody who needs to fulfill the conditions. And in this way, we have a strange evolution of the European Union into a multi-level system, something that should be avoided, as Senada has mentioned. So, but this asymmetry, which has been viewed as a basis for the conditionality, has brought the European Union into a crisis when the countries who joined later feel unequal and feel some kind of oppressed by others, which raises a feedback often known as a backsliding or raise of the national debates and nationalistic or populist approach. And this is something which we need to take into account. And number two, we have a problem from the perspective of economic, right? If you think of the first enlargement, the big enlargement of Central and Eastern European countries, they had to reform their economies from communism into a market economy. And in this perspective, European Union used a lot of efforts to help them transfer the economy into the model that the European Union already had. So it's foreign direct investment related oriented economy. And if you think about Western Balkans and Ukraine, there was a gap of like how many, 20, 25 years. And during this gap, economic reforms in these countries went a different way. So they went in the way that is more related to national elites. And that is why, so both in the Western Balkan countries and in Ukraine, so we have elites which formed in the form of oligarch groups. And these oligarch groups are often influenced by external actors. For example, in Ukraine, we had at least before the war, we had huge influence of Russian oligarch groups and Russian capital, which was a part of this oligarchy system. And from this perspective, pure political conditionality contrasts the economic system which has been formed in a particular country. So speaking about the similarities between Western Balkan and the Ukraine. So first of all, it's the economic model, which is mostly oriented or has to do with national players. And this leads to the situation when there is, I would say, economic discrepancies between the need or the expectation of the society to join the European Union and the interest of the elites, which would rather stay outside the European Union, because going into the European Union, joining the European Union would mean the competition with the European Union companies, businesses on the rules that have been invented and have been practiced in the European Union for decades. Meaning the elites' approach to the accession is contrasted by their own economic interests, and this is something which is not often discussed. Another point to mention is a different set of criteria of conditions, right? If you think of the Central and Eastern European countries, we can mention only Copenhagen criteria and Copenhagen criteria conditionality. You need to be democratic. You need to be. You need to have rule of law and some other things as well. But speaking about Western Balkans, there is conditionality, so-called Copenhagen Plus, which means a lot of national identity-related conditions, something which has to do with the post-war legacies, something which has to do with the ethnic conflicts which Western Balkan experience, and there is a threat that they may come back. And many conditions from this perspective are politically risky for the ruling parties, because if they follow the conditions, if they fulfill the conditions that the European Union sets, they may look as national traitors in the eyes of their own voters. I think a rather similar situation we're going to have after the war in Ukraine, because we don't really know how the war will end up. But still, as David has mentioned, we already have a lot of political and legal issues related to the people who have been on the occupied territories, and these issues are not that evident so far. But when the war is over, we'll definitely have a situation when we need to deal with this, with the people who just lived on the occupied territories. But living on the occupied territories definitely means that they had to earn their money somehow, and then they need to find their bread for their families, which means this or that form of cooperation. I mean, you can't really do that if you don't, if you live on if you you need to survive somehow living on the occupied territories. And then we have this criminal law in some perspective of prosecution for these people who, and of course there is that creates some tension for the future, even and of course it creates some tensions even now, and not speaking about the future. So, but speaking about differences, I would mention that for the Western Balkans, there is not an existential threat that these countries can now see. I would mention that all the countries of the Western Balkans are NATO members, except for Serbia, which develops some kind of security umbrella for them, and which doesn't really put this security perspective as a major argument in terms of accessing the European Union. In other words, Western Balkan countries can perfectly survive without being members of the European Union. For Ukraine, the situation is different because joining the European Union and NATO is one of the survival strategies for Ukraine. And it's definitely clear, this war has demonstrated, that Ukraine alone cannot sustain the aggression from Russian state. I mean, we can fight for some years, but from longer perspective debate, so there is a need for Ukraine to join both NATO and European Union. And from this perspective, we can see that this asymmetry between Ukraine and European Union and NATO is much greater than the asymmetry between Western Balkan countries and the European Union. That issues another leverage for European Union and NATO to ensure that the conditionality is applied and is complied with by Ukraine really fast. But I also would mention that conditionality is often used in a hypocritical way. For example, we all know there has been a lot of debate about Ukraine being a corrupted country, and the biggest issue to have the corruption out of Ukraine, and this is one of the biggest condition of the European Union. But nobody speaks about European Union and Ukraine do not fit in terms of, for example, agriculture policy or the cohesion policy of the European Union. And the recent supply of grains from Ukraine would raise this issue to the very evident point. Like Polish and mostly Polish protests demonstrated that if Ukraine is accepted to the European Union, then there is a huge point which needs to be dealt from the perspective of A, agricultural policy, and C and B, cohesion policy. But somehow these things are masked nowadays and are not really sincerely discussed with the reference of the Ukraine not fulfilling the conditionality, which I think is a different point, and I think they should be discussed in the combination. So conditionality is one thing, but if there is a sincere debate of letting Ukraine join the European Union, then I think other things should be also discussed in a complex. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Alex, for taking us through the whole history, the brief history of the policy of EU conditionality, and also showing us the thorny path ahead for Ukraine in this sense. We will now turn to the last speaker, who's Dr. Vanni D'Alessio. Vanni is a lecturer at the university, lecturing in history at the University of Naples, Federico II, and also he was for a long time with us at the University of Rijeka, so he's a well-known face here. Welcome, Vanni. Vanni will help us tackle a really important question, which is what comes after the war? How can we deal with memory, with the way that war is remembered? So, Vanni, please tell us your insights from your research on Croatia and the wider region, and how you think we might start to reflect about Ukraine's experience ahead for it in the years to come.
Yes, thank you very much, Dana and Peter, for having invited me, and thank you for everyone. I actually think that there are a lot of very interesting insights in what I've heard today, and there is definitely a lot to discuss. And so what we just have heard about the asymmetry, what we heard about other aspects that has been brought about by the others members of the discussions, they are all to be taken into account. Of course, it's very difficult for me from a start. I'm a historian, to frame what I know, which is little, but still it's something I know about Croatian situation, to what actually can be really compared or can go through into another situation, which is Ukraine. But I will try, because anyway, I've been dealing with some aspects like process of memorialization and how the countries and the nation state can deal with this thing. It's also very important. The first talk was about the ICTY. And what differs me from, I think, all of the talks here is that, in a way, I will touch something which deals more with national integration rather than with the problem of international relations, because, so I will start from a case, and then actually will focus on what might happen or why it's interesting, this case, and in general, such cases for development of the national integration process. I will talk today about one case, which is actually sparkled my attention just a couple of days ago, which is a monument in memory of the family. Some of you are very well acquainted by that, more than me probably, is about the family, Zet's family, which was with 3 members of the family which have been killed in December 1991 by members of a reserve unit of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Croatia. They've been killed in Zagreb. And I will start immediately from the plaque, because I took some words from that, which it says that that was placed on the hill over Zagreb. And this place, on the night from the 7th on 8th December, the 12-year-old Alexandra Zec and her mother, Maria Zec, were killed. On the same evening, they witnessed the murder of the father and husband, Mihailo Zec, on the doorstep of their house in Zagreb. Alexandra and Mihailo were our fellow citizens of Serbian nationality. The killers, Alexandra, Mihailo, and Maria, were members of the killers were of the Ministry of Interior's reserve unit. And this is an interesting thing of the plaque, I would say. Despite the confession of the crime, its perpetrators were never punished. That it might, never happen again. This is the plaque. Another thing which is interesting is actually what the mayor of Zagreb been saying in the same days, going on what the thing that murderers committed a big crime, and they were confessed, but they were never held accountable. There's a dark memory and the collective memory. I will go a little faster, not to take too much time. And it is a dark episode from the past and a reminder for the future. This is the mayor of Zagreb. 2 years ago, the president of the Croatian Republic relativized this act, and also what has been done in many situations. Mentioned the thing of the thing that the person was rich, he was robbed by criminal, he was a Serb, nobody will blink an eye. But Vukovar fell 3 weeks before, famous place of the Croatian War, of the Croatian city, which was fell from the Serbian paramilitaries and the Yugoslav army. What the president says, it is terrible, but it's been 30 years. There is no reason for on-day flagellation. That every year the official policy admit it's a sin. Okay, there are, okay, different things which all leave us to what is actually why is interesting to talk about this, because there are many actors involved in this episode. But the thing that, of course, it took so many years and many different moments of Croatian post-war to arrive to a situation in which the mayor opens such a plaque. And also the difficulties that in the Croatian public opinion were pretty clear in how the public opinion was divided over the years, not so maybe literally on the specific crime, but how if the crime should be addressed, how it was addressed. So I don't want to take too long, but I think that from this example we can probably try to talk about a process which started in let's say 1995 until 2023 now. It's a 30 years process, and ask to ourselves in which way the this plaque and the memory can become a part of a reconciliation process in which we could probably say that that a post-war can find some limitations. Another aspect I wanted to address about the plaque and of the Zets family is that, which is very interestingly relates actually to Rijeka city, that in 2014, the head of the theater, the National Theater in Rijeka, organized an event in which he showed a drama called Alexandra Zets, the 12-year-old girl, and there was a public debate in which he wanted to open up the problem about collective guilt and war crimes. The football fans of the Rijeka team and with the veterans, made a demonstration against him, and then went through the principal avenue of the city, showing that actually the divisions in a state, regardless of some moments in which we can find through the intervention in the public space that a collective guilt or a specific crime can be addressed by society. Even though there are these kinds of processes, at the same time, it's very interesting to follow how actually in the internal way and in the international integration process of a country, these war crimes are somehow still embedded in a discussion which starts to divide the whole public opinion into even topics which, through the process that I have been mentioning in some spots, arrives to very further ones. I don't have really the time to elaborate on this, but I think that Croatia can show a very geographical and ideological division, which comes up very clearly in some situation when there are elections, which came up at the referendum which was held on the same-sex marriages. And so there are many elements which you can say, if that opening of the plaque, if the words of the mayor can tell us, okay, we have a length of a post-war, and this can state, a point which can even tell us, okay, we arrived there in a almost, finding, a solution to a question on how long is a post-war. And now, in the last minute that I'm here, I would say, 1918 had its very long post-war, which actually never ended because World War II started. Because also of a lot of problems carried by the post-war. 1945 had a different end and a different reconciliation process. But I would say that both 1918 and 1945 as end of wars actually reverberated at the end of the century in the post-Habsburg and post-Ottoman problems in Yugoslavia. And also, all in all, after in 1945, you see still problems in the Ukrainian-Russian borderlands. So what is, if we can ask to us, how to measure the length of the post-war? Also, because when you talk about Western Balkans, there is the Croatian post-war, but there is the Bosnian Herzegovinian, the Republika Srpska, Federation, Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Slovenia, all engaged somehow in some degrees of conflict. So where is the national integration moment in which we can say that this thing has arrived to an important point? I think the capacity of a state to deal with crimes committed in the name of the nation, and the condemnation, public condemnation, and so going through a phase of reconciliation in which these things can be addressed publicly, of course, it's an important moment. Of course, what we just heard about the existential threat, and but even before, about the shrinking of the, the shrinking of the space of the denial, can all come into the discussion what we are dealing to us today. But I will leave to the discussion we might have from now on. So I'm done.
Thank you so much, Vanni, for these really interesting thoughts. So I will now pass over to Peter if he's able to take over for the Q&A. I don't see him very actively engaged on Zoom, so I will then, without further ado, open the floor. We have not a lot of time, but we have some good 10 minutes, maybe 15, if there are a lot of questions. So please, the floor is open for anybody who would like to ask a question. So just either turn on your camera or raise your hand and to make an intervention. And that actually includes the speakers in case they would have anything to raise or to ask other speakers. I can see maybe Jared with his camera on, and in case you're...
Yeah.
Yes, would you like...
Sure.
I know you're joining us from Kiev also, so...
Yeah, I'm an American journalist based between Zagreb and Kiev, so I figured it would be good to attend. I remember this summer when I was in Zagreb, I went to that house that Vanni was talking about, and it was abandoned, and there was no plaque at the time, and I was a little bit confused by that, and then I learned about the debate, and now since I've been in Kiev, the plaque is there, so progress still happens in many years later. But my question is for Eva, which is, if we think about a reality in which Russia never cooperates with a war crimes procedure, there is no a very limited possibility to have suspects appear in person. If that is like what ends up being the case, and it increasingly looks like that would be, what international mechanisms are actually available or feasible? I mean, we see the in absentia trials happening in cases where, through a lot of effort, Ukrainians are able to identify specific soldiers, right? But that's hard to do. It's rare. We see those happening. Is that possible at a more internationally recognized level? What is possible, and what could be the significance of it? Is my question.
Thanks, Jared. So this is a very good question, and there's a lot of debate outside of the former Yugoslavia, outside of Ukraine, about in absentia trials more generally. And there's a lot of division. What is the point? Are these fair trials? There's a lot of critique sort of about that. International tribunals, generally speaking, don't do in absentia trials. We only had one tribunal, the one that dealt with Lebanon, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, that did in absentia trials. And that is generally not considered our best international tribunal. I'm not sure if that's a direct connection, relationship, or explanation. But generally speaking, for example, the International Criminal Court has an arrest warrant against Putin, but they would not be able to conduct an in absentia proceeding. One thing that I would raise here is, even though at the moment, and I was talking to some other journalists earlier today about this as well, even though at the moment it doesn't seem very likely that Putin is going to ever face trial in The Hague, I would just like to remind everyone here that when I first arrived to The Hague 14 years ago, both Mladic and Karadzic have been fugitives for like the best of 15 years or something like that. And no one thought that they would ever be caught. And then they were. And then no one thought that they would survive the trials because, of course, they're, you know, already older gentlemen at the time. And then they did. And then the appeals happened, and now they're both serving lifelong sentences, which basically means that even for a long time, if it may seem impossible, there might come a time where political forces realign, where something happens, which then makes this possible. So the chances are remote, but they're not non-existent because as I, you know, it's almost 15 years people were chasing Ratko Mladic, and then he, you know, something happened and then he was here. So as long as Putin is alive, and this also goes for high-level Russian officials, if they go travel to France because their wife wants to shop, which, you know, are things that happen. Some people have apartments in London, you know, there may be arrests, there may be sort of cases that do end up in The Hague at some point in the future. So it's not all is lost. That's basically what.
Yeah, I mean, you could even go down to the level of commanders, you know, so like whether they're able to isolate like who was in charge of you know, the bombardment of Mariupol at specific points. You know,
and I'm sure I would assume that more cases may be coming at the International Criminal Court, and Ukraine is getting a lot of attention in The Hague, a little bit less these days because of Israel and Palestine, of course. However, it has been a really large conversation about these kinds of mechanisms. Ukrainians are also very, very active. So I wouldn't lose hope. It's not a hopeless situation.
Thank you very much. I had small problems with my internet connection in post-war Austria, but now I'm back. So maybe as Dana also mentioned, that if somebody has a question, should raise the hand, or maybe can try also to write a message to me. But I would like to have also a question to Vanni D'Alessio, but also to others if they have to answer that. Is because as I understood you, Vanni, you would say that the memory politics is a way to establish a common national reconciliation within the framework of the national state, even if there are a lot of minorities and, of course, polarizing debates about the history. So would you say that the memory politics is a good tool for reconciliation, or it's maybe other field of the war, even if it's the post-war field?
I think it's not so much as a tool to, you know, to bring something more as a tool of measuring the process, and because I don't see only this, you know, one actor in this involved, but you know there are different actors, even what I say now. There's one thing I didn't say, which I think I found interesting during the discussion. David mentioned Mariupol. Actually, we can see there that it, you know, in a way, but also even in Ukraine, you can see patterns of the post-war in the war, of course, and the nationalization process. It's like an economic aspect, but also an aspect which deals with the public opinion, which doesn't have only one the state actor in process. So it's also about a different organization and groups which are involved, how much of course they can be involved, because then we have different situation in Russia, you know, and but so I wouldn't talk about as something. I don't see that, you know, I don't talk about national integration in something which we have to get to be more happy in a you know, good end. If I express myself goodly.
Maybe to follow in Vanni's footsteps, because if there is nobody else with a burning question on this issue of nationalization and privatization, I wanted to ask David his thoughts, because this was definitely a very burning issue in the countries of in the successor Yugoslav states, because clearly, you know, privatization was happening as war was raging, also because the transition from a command economy to a market economy was happening basically in that period. So you had a lot of opportunities for enrichment in that moment. So I wanted to ask you basically a two-pronged question. The first is, where does Ukraine stand now in terms of its privatization process? So has it already been carried out to a large extent, or do we have quite a lot of things that are state-owned? Has there been a renationalization during the war as well? So what's the situation there in terms of the ownership rights? And the second one is, what are you observing in your research in terms of the elites that are behind these processes? So obviously we know that there's been a lot of attention on corruption in Ukraine also before the war, and we know also that there is a very strong civil society in Ukraine, which is very, very encouraging, actually, that is fighting against corruption and keeping these things in check. So definitely, you know, a different level of awareness than there was in Croatia. But what do you think is happening right now? Do we have a new elite, or do we have like kind of the old elites, both Ukrainian and Russian, sort of reinventing themselves in some ways? And obviously my question is to David, but if Alex has something to add from the ground, and maybe Jared as well, that would be great to hear their thoughts too.
Yeah, thanks. A very good question. Yeah, Alex may have others to add. I mean, I think in a way it's sort of too early to tell, but I think that obviously during the war, you know, war is a great sort of disguise for property redistribution, right? And for changes in the economy. And war, you know, there's a justified reason for sometimes taking over certain companies during war. But what we've seen in Ukraine is a pretty interesting process, I think, in which there has been nationalization of a range of companies that seem to be of strategic importance. Broadly speaking, these companies that are linked to oligarchs or former oligarchs, will have some linkage to Russia. Ukhnafta, for example, a company linked to Kolomoisky, and others. So books at 4:30. All right, let's go on. Sorry, I'm going to get kicked out of here. Yes, and the question is, what happens to those you know, really significant assets? There's been a lot of political dispute over who controls particular companies. Again, in the energy sector in particular. So I think that's something that, you know, the Ukrainian elite really needs to try and find new rules of the game. Yes, we're moving away from the old oligarch system, sort of de-oligarchization going on, but unfortunately, we don't yet have a clear path towards a new system in which it's going to be rules of the game and rule of law, as opposed to maybe just a new configuration of different types of owners. I'm really sorry I'm getting thrown out of this room, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you. But thanks so much. It was a really interesting discussion.
Thank you, David, for joining us and for resisting up to this point. Do by any chance have Jared or Alex have other thoughts on this issue, or anybody else among the audience? Yes, the audience or the
I think I can add something. Well, number one, so there was a time gap between the fall of communism in Central and Eastern European countries and their fast accession to the European Union. And this gap of 25 years between these countries and countries of Western Balkans and Ukraine has made it very differently, because European Union assisted the countries of Central and Eastern European and Central Eastern Europe right into the model that the European Union had itself. So it was the model of direct foreign investment oriented economy. While during this gap of 25 years, countries of Western Balkans and Ukraine developed its own model, which is different from that one. And the model, the economic model which exists in both Western Balkan countries and Ukraine is, number one, is much more closed to foreign investments. And number two, is much less transparent. So it's oriented for national oligarch groups. And meanwhile, so we have also influence from Russian capital, like there was mentioned Kolomoisky, but Kolomoisky is a Ukrainian guy. We have Firtash, we have we have a lot of other native Russian oligarchs who have been owning oligarch groups in Ukraine. And that was a main difference in terms of both economic development of Ukraine and political agenda for the Ukrainian state. And now the situation, it's been changed in many ways, but it also causes the polarization and further uncertainty what way to choose, because we don't have the support from the European Union in terms of the transformation of economic model, and now we don't have Russian capital in Ukraine, so there is a kind of uncertainty what's going to happen after the war and how the economic model should be developed after the war. And this is one of the post-war discussions that should be raised, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just that, I've noted journalistic investigations that have looked at sort of oligarchical agricultural industry figures who have been on publicly waving the Ukrainian flag while at the same time doing business, continue to do business with Russia, and that being a source of journalistic digging. I think I wanted to share one other article in the group chat, which is a lot of the internal cultural frictions here don't get, I think, a lot of understandably international media attention. You certainly can't copy paste the Balkan experience to Ukraine either. But the article I'm going to share is just, there was a recent controversy of a professor here who came out saying that she didn't believe Russian-speaking Ukrainians were really Ukrainians, and she was fired relatively quickly and denounced. And I think people may, find parallels or interesting things in there. Just putting it out there to highlight it so people know.
Well, thank you so much, Jared. Yeah, feel free to send it to me if the chat is not open to everybody, and I will. Oh yeah, you managed. Fantastic. Thank you. That's a really interesting.
Actually, it says a lot how much, in a way, Ukrainian and Croatian situation in the pre-war and war were different, because we all know the epuration in Croatia in 1990, 1991, and I think Ukraine in that really falls in a different situation, and it, so the killing that I mentioned before, it's part of a very different situation than was going on, because of the both, of Croatia, how differently, and the political party of Croatia, how differently even covered the killing, not just, made the situation, nationalizing situation that allowed to some political, police figures of the Minister of Interior to think that they were free of possible charges. So that was a different situation, I would say, in which I think Russian elements in Ukraine, that are were not epurated in that way. That's what I want to say. But of course, I'm not an expert on Ukraine.
No, it's a great point. I think we unfortunately know a thing or two in Croatia about people waving the national flag and doing things behind this act that were far less honorable. So it is an apt metaphor, simile on which to end our discussion on. Let me just thank once again all the speakers, but also all the members of the audience who've been so patient and to stay with us for the full hour and a half in pre-Christmas period. So thank you for this. I hope that you will found the discussion as interesting as I did. This discussion will be recorded, so you will have the opportunity to listen to it on our YouTube channel. And please do keep checking our website for our future events. We have two coming up next week, one on the Serbian elections and another one on dialogues for peace, so perspectives for Palestine and the Middle East. Once again, thank you very much to everybody. Have a good afternoon and a good evening.
Much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Peter and Tena. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Tena.